look at temperature as a controllable parameter and not just an afterthought. Whoever's technology you use, make sure that you realize that there's no point weighing something to 5 significant figures if you then assume that the water bath is plus or minus 2 degrees. You need to get everything lined up so that it works.
Hey, smart biotech scientists, welcome back. We are in the middle of an exciting conversation about cryopreservation. Perhaps you're wondering, what are the best cryopreservation strategies and technologies? Well, we are having a conversation with Mark Davison, who is an experienced entrepreneur and is now the CEO of Grand Instruments, a leading company in laboratory equipment. And before we jump into part 2, tell us what you think of part 1 by leaving a review. And if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I invite you to go back and listen first to part 1. So stay tuned. Are you juggling the complexities of CMC development while trying to enjoy the beauty of biotech? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to simplify bioprocessing? Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast, where we're diving headfirst into the very challenges you face. We're breaking it down, demystifying the jargon, and giving you the keys to unlock your full potential. I'm your host, David Brohlman, and I get it. With 15 plus years in the biotech industry, I face the same challenges you do. There's a way to simplify and streamline so you can remove complexity, you can skip trials and errors, deliver without delay your groundbreaking therapy to clinics and market, and still enjoy every single step. Do you want to learn how industry experts and I did it? Grab a cup of coffee and your favorite notebook and pen. Now is the time to take your bioprocessing game to the next level. Let's smarten up biotech. Your company focuses also on the data acquisition because that's an important piece as well. Because if you want to do a controlled rate freezing, you need to measure what's going on. And doing this accurately. So how do you ensure the integrity and the accuracy of the data you're acquiring?
Yeah, sure. So we have data acquisition built into the control rate freezer. So that we know what the head temperature is when we're freezing. Of course, the difficulty sometimes with those kind of measurements is that you can measure what the aluminum head is as a temperature, but then there's a millimeter of polypropylene between that temperature and your sample, which is inside a cryo vial, for example. So sometimes it's useful to have a separate probe going into a dummy vial so that you can see what's happening in that vial as well. And therefore we use a different system. It's really an analog to digital converter, if we think it that way. So it takes an analog signal, which is temperature, but it could be an electrical signal, for example. It could be humidity, it could be carbon dioxide concentration, and it converts that very accurately into a digital response, which can then be processed, filtered, analyzed, displayed in a PC. And that's, it's in a box about the size of a paperback novel, something like that. And what's that doing is taking a very accurate temperature probe, which is just a very fine wire that goes into the sample, and reading that temperature and reading the physical action of that and converting it into a digital signal. And sounds easy, but actually the detail is the important thing, because clearly there's a lot of noise. The smaller the signal you see, the more important the noise is in that equation. So if you have any sort of thermal noise in your system, then the small changes that you want to look for will be lost. Same with electronics. If you don't have very good systems, then it's just lost in the background. So we actually use our systems to test for those very small changes, because we can make our system have a very high signal to noise ratio with a whole number of specialized electronics in the box. But fundamentally, it boils down to demonstrating that you know what it is you measured. Like we said before, it's not that you need to know everything to 7 significant figures. It's just that you need to know what it was, and you need to know what's the variability between runs and all of those parameters that could be having an effect on your outcome.
Now, we're in a time where the industry is moving at a supersonic speed. Every day we have new technologies coming out. I'm sure your sector is no different. How do you stay ahead of the curve? How do you do that?
it's interesting. These are great times to be in. I think the acceleration of technology generally, even just in the last 10 or 5 years, has been astonishing. I mean, you just look at an iPhone nowadays, that would have been a whole building full of computing just 40 years ago. It's just incredible. So the way that we keep abreast generally and corporately, and me personally, is just by trying to meet as many people as possible. And that means getting out of the building. So my day job is to run a company, but actually the thing that I really enjoy is getting in front of customers, talking to customers, understanding how they do their job, understanding what makes them annoyed, what they like, what they don't like, what problems they have. And sometimes you need to really have a conversation for them to realize a problem they didn't realize they had. And that comes from just talking about science. Even though I haven't worn a lab coat for quite a while, I still enjoy talking about bench science and try to keep as sharp as I can on what's going on with biology and chemistry and physics, and just talk to scientists in that way. And then try to figure out, where is there an advance that can be productized that many scientists can use? So we do a whole bunch of things, from custom-made one-off devices where the market size is one. And there's a professor somewhere who needs something and nothing in the market will do, and he wants us to make it. That's great, but there's a premium and we only ever do it once. So we've made things with robot arms dunking into multiple water baths and all sorts of weird and crazy stuff. We've made temperature control devices with a 10-foot steel beam, all sorts of weird things. More normally, we look for technological advances or process advances in laboratory ways of doing things that we can then bring into our product line. And that typically is things around data transfer. So back in the day, everything, back in the original, when we first data recorders back in the, I guess, 60s, it was like those earthquake recorders with a very fine pen on a needle that swings, those things. And that's what labs used to record almost everything. And then that became much more digital output with LEDs. And then eventually now everybody is going towards Bluetooth or other remote wireless technologies. That trend towards not needing to be in front of the machine is a strong one, I think, that will continue. You can be in the cockpit of your lab, if you like, without having to stand right over every piece of equipment all the time. Or you can be in the coffee room and you get a beep to say that your centrifuge is finished, or that kind of stuff will be a bit more interesting, I think.
What has inspired you to enter the lab equipment industry?
So for me personally, this role came up kind of by accident. I was talking to a friend of mine and he said, this company is looking for someone. And then I thought, and I remembered that name in my undergraduate days in the laboratory. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. And Grant Instruments has been around since the 50s. We actually very, very slightly predate the discovery of the DNA structure. So 1951 was when we were incorporated. So we're kind of pre-molecular biology in some ways, which means that we have a very long legacy of being in labs for things. Some of those things in the early days were very much heating and cooling, water bath type applications. Nowadays, they might be very, very high tech. One of the things that we did several years ago was looking at the currents that are used to separate rocket stages. So when a rocket blasts off and the first piece breaks off and it carries on, all that kind of thing, it's explosive bolts that push the pieces apart in space. And those are triggered by a current. So what you don't want to have happen is fluctuations in the microcurrents cause it to go off prematurely. So they have to test that. So our data recorders were used to test the microcurrents in those explosive bolts on the ground to make sure that they weren't going to have problems in the air. So that whole spectrum from the 50s to now is so wide, but yet encompasses that thread of doing something that scientists see a value in and that they want to trust you to do that piece for them is really important. So that's what gets me up in the morning. That's why I like this job, is that you can really get to the very heart of science. Yeah, we don't get the PhDs, we don't get the Nobels, but we're probably in a lot of different labs around the world in the background, and people don't realize it's there, but that precision water bath or that precision centrifuge or whatever it might be is really critical to how they get their results.
Wow, fantastic. Mark, since you're having a lot of conversations with entrepreneurs, with customers, what common themes emerge when talking to scientific entrepreneurs, and what advice would you give to aspiring entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think there's scientific entrepreneurs are the same as every other entrepreneur, which is it's hard work, right? So If you want to make quick money, go into banking. Don't go into science. So it's not something that you go into with a view to getting rich quick. Some people do get rich in biotech, but it's a myth that that's an easy path. It's really usually difficult. There's probably more companies that have failed than have succeeded. I've certainly got some business cards from companies that nobody remembers because they just didn't work out for whatever reason. And that's life. You have to be able to tolerate that risk that you might not succeed. In the same way that, maybe scientists are pre-adapted because most experiments fail. That's why my podcast is called The Big Experiment, because that process of taking something out of the lab and saying, my hypothesis is that this will make a business, could easily be wrong, and often is wrong. That's really the first stage. Is if you're not prepared to fail, don't start. I think the second stage is there's a huge amount of support out there. If you're in a city that has an established biotech scene, then there will be people who've been there and done that for almost every problem that you come across, whether it's financial, whether it's getting lab space, whether it's hiring. There's a good ecosystem of people who will help you for free if you ask nicely, and you should use that. I live in Cambridge, and it's fantastic for that kind of interdependency and people helping each other out. But there's similar cities all over the world, places like Heidelberg, for example, the huge communities of molecular biology and other things going on that you can tap into. So don't be afraid to jump out the lab. I think the time to do it is when you've nothing to lose, probably. That's the time to give it a go. Isn't that interesting that even in science, it comes also down to people at the end of the day? We need other people and we shouldn't be doing it alone. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think if you have that kind of superiority, God complex, then you're almost destined to fail because nobody can know everything. You can be the world's best molecular biologist, but are you really going to know how to interpret a rental agreement on that building you just rented? No, of course not. So you need to learn that you're not the smartest guy in the room most of the time. And for me, that was an easy learning. But you need to just realize that you can let go of most tasks, actually, more than you think. Yeah, that's good advice, especially for you smart biotech scientists. You're not the smartest person in the room. Go find a room where there are smarter people. Exactly. And you don't need to be the smartest person in the room. I think that's the important thing, right? You need to have the group doing the thing which gets you there most efficiently. And that leader on that given day for that task may not be you, the founder. It might be the junior person who knows about AI or whatever else it may be that you need to get over the hurdle that day. Which comes down to culture as well. I think culture is important in early stage companies in any sphere, particularly in science, where usually the people who get to postdoc level science have been the bright kid in their class all the way from kindergarten. They're used to being that kid who knows stuff. So getting used to being a collective that gets stuff done is really important, and having a culture that nurtures that process that everybody has an input and everybody's valued is really critical. As we're wrapping up, Mark, what is your 20-second takeaway from our conversation? I think from the technical perspective, look at temperature as a controllable parameter and not just an afterthought. Whoever's technology you use, make sure that you realize that there's no point weighing something to 5 significant figures if you then assume that the water bath is plus or minus 2 degrees. You need to get everything lined up so that it works. And I think on the people side, I would just encourage anybody who is in a lab with an idea that they think is commercial to go see their university tech transfer office or go see their supervisor or go and talk to colleagues and peers and just see what's it like and how does it work. And it's not as scary as it looks. Mark, where can people connect with you? So you can find me on LinkedIn easily enough. So it's Mark Davison 100, or you can just Google my name and it'll be in there. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn. You can have a look and a listen at my podcast, which is called The Big Experiment, all the usual outlets. And again, that's really around that interface between science and business. How do entrepreneurs get born? And feel free to DM me on any of those channels as well. I love to interact. Fantastic. I'm going to leave all the links down in the show notes. And please do reach out to Mark. Use this opportunity to connect. And thank you once again, Mark, for your insights, for sharing these so freely here and generously on the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. And it was a pleasure having you on today. Absolutely, David. Absolutely great fun. Thank you very much. Hey, Smart Biotech Scientists. Thank you very much for tuning in today. What did you think about today's conversation with Mark Davison?
please tell us by leaving a review. And perhaps you still have questions about cryopreservation or just how you can master bioprocesses. Well, I want to offer you a free 30-minute assessment. Just book the call, no strings attached. I'm happy to help you get started. Book the call using the show notes below, and I see you on the call. All right, smart scientists. That's all for today on the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on your journey to bioprocess mastery. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, we can empower more scientists like you. For additional bioprocessing tips, visit us at smartbiotechscientist.com. Stay tuned for more inspiring biotech insights in our next episode. Until then, let's continue to smarten up biotech.